I buried my husband on a Tuesday in March, and by Friday, I was back at work because grief doesn't pay the mortgage and silence doesn't feed you when you're alone in a house that still smells like his cologne. My name is Patricia Williamson, I'm 63 years old, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I wasn't always the kind of woman who could look someone in the eye and take everything away from them without blinking. I used to be soft. I used to believe that love was enough, that family meant loyalty, that if you gave everything you had, people would remember. They don't. They forget. And when they forget, they take more. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever given until you had nothing left and watched people walk away anyway, then you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. And if you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. Because this story, as ugly and raw as it gets, isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever been used, discarded, and underestimated. Make sure you check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories that don't hold back. Stories that dig into the truth of what happens when quiet women finally stop being quiet. My husband, Daniel, died of a heart attack in our driveway. He was carrying groceries. I heard the bags hit the pavement before I heard him fall. By the time I got to him, his eyes were already distant, like he was looking past me into somewhere I couldn't follow. The paramedics said it was instant, that he didn't suffer, but I don't believe that. I think he knew. I think in that last second, he felt his heart give out and he thought of me, standing there, about to be left behind. We'd been married for 39 years. We had one son. His name is Jeremy. And Jeremy, God help me, was the reason I kept breathing after Daniel died, even when I didn't want to. Jeremy was our miracle baby. I'd had 3 miscarriages before him, each one a small death I carried in my body like a stone. When he finally arrived, pink and screaming and perfect, I thought I'd been given a second chance at everything. Daniel and I poured ourselves into that boy. We saved every penny. We went without vacations, without new cars, without the kinds of luxuries our friends had, because we wanted Jeremy to have opportunities we never did. I worked double shifts as a medical billing clerk. Daniel worked construction until his knees gave out, and then he drove trucks on weekends to make up the difference. We paid for Jeremy's college in full. Every single semester. Not a dime of debt. When he graduated with a degree in business, I cried so hard I couldn't see his face on the stage. Jeremy married a woman named Brooke 3 years after college. I met her twice before the wedding. She was polished in a way I never was, perfect nails, perfect hair, one of those voices that sounds sweet until you realize it never changes tone no matter what she's saying. She smiled at me with all her teeth and called me Mama Pat like we were already close, but her eyes didn't smile. They assessed. They calculated. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just nervous about losing my son. Daniel said I was overthinking it. He said Brooke seemed nice, that she made Jeremy happy, and wasn't that what mattered? So I swallowed my instincts. I bought into the idea that love was supposed to look like this, shiny and new and full of promise. The wedding was expensive. Not extravagant, but expensive in the way that young couples' weddings are when they want everything to look like a magazine spread. Jeremy asked if we could help. Daniel and I took out a small loan against the house. $15,000. We didn't tell Jeremy about the loan. We just said yes, of course, whatever you need, because that's what parents do. Brooke's parents contributed, but not as much. I remember her mother making a comment at the rehearsal dinner about how some people are just more financially comfortable than others, and I felt Daniel's hand squeeze mine under the table. We weren't comfortable. We were drowning. But we smiled and nodded and toasted to the happy couple. Because what else could we do? After the wedding, things shifted. Jeremy got a job at a marketing firm, but it didn't pay well at first. Brooke worked part-time at a boutique, the kind of place that sold candles for $40. They rented an apartment in a part of town I couldn't afford to visit without feeling out of place. And slowly, quietly, they started asking for help. Can you cover our car insurance this month? Just until Jeremy's bonus comes through? Can you loan us money for the security deposit on a better apartment? Can you help with Brooke's student loans? She's really stressed about them, Mom, and I don't want her to feel like she married into struggle. Every time, I said yes. Every time, Daniel said yes. We cashed out part of his 401k. We skipped dental appointments. We ate the same meals on rotation, spaghetti, chicken, beans, repeat, because it was cheap and we could stretch it. I didn't mind. That's the thing people don't understand. I didn't mind giving. I loved my son. I wanted him to have the life we couldn't. But there's a difference between giving and being bled dry. And somewhere along the way, without me noticing, Jeremy stopped asking and started expecting. He stopped saying thank you. He stopped checking in to see how we were doing. When Daniel died, Jeremy came to the funeral, but he didn't stay long. He said he had to get back to work, that Brooke wasn't feeling well, that he'd call me later. He didn't call. Not that week. Not the next. I spent the first month after Daniel's death in a fog. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching things that used to be ours but now were just mine. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug I couldn't bring myself to wash, the jacket he wore that still hung by the door. I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard him breathing next to me, and then I'd remember, and the silence would crush me all over again. I didn't eat much. I didn't sleep much. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until my body just gave up on tears and left me hollow. Jeremy called once during that time. Once. He asked how I was doing in the same tone you'd used to ask someone about the weather. I said I was fine because I didn't know how to say anything else. He said that was good, that Brooke sent her love, that he'd try to visit soon. He didn't. It was my neighbor, a woman named Gail who'd lived next door for 20 years, who finally forced me out of the house. She showed up one Saturday with a casserole and a look on her face that said she wasn't leaving until I ate something. We sat at my kitchen table, and she talked while I picked at the food. She told me about her own husband's death 15 years earlier, about how she'd survived it, about how grief was something you had to move through, not around. She said I needed to start taking care of myself, that Daniel wouldn't want me to disappear. And then she said something that stuck with me. She said, "Patricia, you've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Maybe it's time you figured out who you are when no one's asking you for anything." I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. Who was I when no one needed me? I didn't know. I'd been a wife, a mother, a worker, a giver. I'd been the person people came to when they needed something fixed, paid for, forgiven. But I didn't know who I was underneath all of that. So I started trying to figure it out. I went back to work full-time. I paid off the funeral expenses. I organized Daniel's things, keeping what mattered and donating the rest. I planted flowers in the front yard because Daniel always wanted a garden but never had time. I started walking every morning, just to feel my body moving, to remind myself I was still alive. And slowly, painfully, I started to rebuild. But Jeremy didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. He called every few weeks, always with the same vague pleasantries, always ending the conversation before it could go anywhere real. I tried to talk to him about how I was feeling, about how hard it had been, but he'd change the subject or say he had to go. Brooke never called. Not once. And when I asked Jeremy if they'd like to come over for dinner, he always had an excuse. They were busy. They had plans. Maybe next month. Next month never came. I started to feel it then, that creeping realization that something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't just grieving Daniel anymore. I was grieving the loss of my son, too. Because the Jeremy I'd raised, the boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared, who used to tell me I was his favorite person in the world, that boy was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as an obligation, a checkbook, a voice on the phone he tolerated out of duty. And the worst part? I couldn't pinpoint when it had happened. It was like watching someone drift away in slow motion, and by the time you realize they're too far to reach, it's already too late. If you've stuck with me this far, I need you to do something. I need you to hit that subscribe button, because this story gets worse before it gets better, and I want you here for all of it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ever felt taken for granted, someone who's ever wondered if they're the only one who sees what's really happening. And check the description box below. There are more stories there, stories about women like me who didn't stay silent forever. I think the final straw, the moment I started to see the truth clearly, was Jeremy's 35th birthday. I wanted to do something special. I couldn't afford much, but I put together a dinner at my house. I cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with roasted vegetables and homemade rolls, the same meal I'd made every year since he was a kid. I bought a small cake from the bakery and a card where I wrote about how proud I was of him, how much I loved him, how grateful I was that he was mine. I invited him and Brooke over, and they said they'd come. I spent the whole day cleaning, cooking, making everything perfect. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones Daniel and I got as wedding gifts that we almost never used. I wanted it to feel special. I wanted Jeremy to remember that he still had a mother who loved him. They showed up an hour late. Brooke walked in first, and I could see immediately that she didn't want to be there. She glanced around the house like she was cataloging everything wrong with it: the outdated furniture, the worn carpet, the walls that needed paint. Jeremy followed behind her, glued to his phone. I hugged him, and he hugged me back, but it was stiff, like hugging a stranger. I asked how they were, how work was going, how life was treating them. Brooke answered in one-word responses. Jeremy barely looked up. The dinner I'd spent all day preparing was eaten in near silence. Brooke picked at her food and said she wasn't that hungry. Jeremy ate quickly, checking his phone between bites. When I brought out the cake and started to sing Happy Birthday, Brooke laughed, not a kind laugh, but the kind that makes you feel small. She said, "This is so cute, like a little kid's party," and Jeremy laughed with her. I felt something crack inside me then. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I smiled and cut the cake and told myself it didn't matter, that they were just tired, that I was being too sensitive. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. They didn't see me as a person anymore. I was just an old woman, a relic from Jeremy's past, someone who existed in the background of his life but didn't really matter. And that night, after they left early because Brooke said she had a headache, I sat alone at my kitchen table surrounded by dirty dishes and half-eaten cake, and I cried. Not because they hurt my feelings, though they did, but because I finally understood. I'd given everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And that was just the beginning. The weeks after Jeremy's birthday blurred together in a haze of routine and quiet disappointment. I went to work, came home, ate dinner alone, watched television I didn't care about, and went to bed. I tried calling Jeremy a few times, but he rarely answered, and when he did, the conversations were short and empty. He'd ask how I was doing in that detached way that made it clear he didn't really want to know, and then he'd make up an excuse to get off the phone. I stopped calling as much. I told myself it was because I didn't want to bother him, but the truth was simpler: I couldn't handle the rejection anymore. Every unanswered call, every rushed conversation, every time he chose Brooke's voice in the background over mine, it chipped away at something I couldn't afford to lose. But even though Jeremy had pulled away emotionally, he never stopped asking for money. That's what hurt the most. He could ignore me for weeks, could forget to return my calls, could cancel plans at the last minute, but the second he needed something, I'd hear from him. And I kept saying yes. I kept saying yes because I didn't know how to say no, because some desperate part of me believed that if I just kept giving, he'd eventually remember who I was, who we used to be. I thought love worked like a bank account. You deposit enough, and eventually you get something back. I was wrong. It started small after the birthday dinner. Jeremy called one afternoon and said they needed help with their rent. He didn't explain why. He didn't apologize for asking. He just said, "Mom, we're a little short this month, can you cover us?" And I asked how much and transferred the money before I could think about it. $800. Then, 2 weeks later, Brooke's car broke down, and they needed $1,200 for repairs. A month after that, Jeremy said they were trying to save for a house and asked if I could help with their credit card debt. Just a little, just enough to get them back on track. $3,000. I took it out of the small savings account Daniel and I had built over decades, the account we'd planned to use for retirement, for emergencies, for something other than this. Every time I transferred money, I felt a little sicker. Not because I didn't want to help, but because Jeremy never seemed grateful. He'd say thanks in passing, like I'd held the door open for him, and then move on. He didn't ask how I was managing. He didn't ask if I could afford it. He just assumed I could, or maybe he didn't care. Brooke never acknowledged the money at all. Not once. I'd send thousands of dollars to help with their problems, and she wouldn't even send a text. I started to wonder if Jeremy even told her where the money came from, or if he just let her believe they were figuring it out on their own. I tried talking to Jeremy about it once. I called him on a Saturday afternoon, and when he answered, I could hear Brooke laughing in the background, the sound of them living their lives without worry. I asked him how things were going financially, if they were doing okay, if maybe they could start budgeting a little more carefully so they didn't need as much help. He got defensive immediately. He said he was doing his best, that life was expensive, that I didn't understand how hard it was for young people these days. He said, "It's not like your generation, Mom. Everything costs more now." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "Okay, I understand, I'm sorry." And then I hung up and cried in my bathroom where no one could hear me. The thing about being used is that it happens so slowly you don't realize it's happening until you're already empty. You don't wake up one day and think, I'm being taken advantage of. It creeps in. A favor here, a loan there, a pattern of giving that feels normal until you look back and see how one-sided it's been all along. And the worst part is that you let it happen because you love the person doing it. You tell yourself they need you, that they'll appreciate you eventually, that this is just a rough patch. You convince yourself that sacrifice is the same thing as love. It's not. Sacrifice without reciprocity isn't love, it's erosion. I started keeping track after that phone call. Not because I wanted to hold it over Jeremy's head, but because I needed to see it written down, needed to know I wasn't imagining things. I pulled up my bank statements and went through every transaction from the last 3 years, since Daniel died. I made a list. $15,000 for the wedding loan. $8,000 for rent over various months. $1,200 for Brooke's car. $3,000 for credit card debt. $2,000 for furniture when they moved to a bigger apartment. $600 for Jeremy's new laptop. $500 here, $300 there. Small amounts that didn't seem like much at the time but added up to more than I'd realized. In total, I'd given them nearly $32,000 in 3 years. $32,000 I didn't have, that I'd scraped together by working overtime, skipping doctor's appointments, eating less, sacrificing every small comfort I might have had. And what had I gotten in return? Silence. Distance. A son who saw me as an ATM with a heartbeat. I kept the list in a drawer in my kitchen, tucked under old bills and grocery receipts, and every time Jeremy called asking for money, I'd pull it out and look at it. I never showed it to him. I never brought it up. I just added the new amount and put it back. I think some part of me believed that if I documented it, if I could prove how much I'd given, then someday Jeremy would see it and understand. He'd realize what I'd sacrificed. He'd come back. He'd be sorry. But deep down, I knew better. People who take from you without seeing you don't suddenly wake up and start seeing. They just keep taking until there's nothing left. Things got worse in the spring. Jeremy called and said they were planning a vacation. Nothing big, just a long weekend at a beach resort to de-stress. He didn't ask if I wanted to come. He didn't suggest we spend time together. He just said, we're going away for a few days, like it was information I needed to know but didn't concern me. 2 days later, he called again. The vacation was more expensive than they'd thought. Could I help? Just a little, just so they didn't have to cancel. I asked how much. $1,500. I said I didn't have it. He said, come on, Mom, you always figure it out. And I did. I took it out of the emergency fund I'd been rebuilding since Daniel's death, the fund that was supposed to keep me afloat if something went wrong. And I transferred the money, and Jeremy said thanks, and they went on vacation without me. They posted pictures. I saw them on Brooke's social media, her in a bikini on the beach, Jeremy with a drink in his hand, both of them smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. The caption said something about much-needed rest and living our best lives. I stared at those pictures for a long time. I thought about the emergency fund sitting at zero. I thought about the overtime shifts I'd worked to rebuild it. I thought about the fact that I hadn't taken a vacation since Daniel and I went to Niagara Falls for our 20th anniversary, and even then we'd stayed in a cheap motel and eaten gas station sandwiches to save money. And I felt something inside me harden. Not anger, not yet. Just a cold, creeping realization that I was never going to be part of their lives the way I wanted to be. I was a resource. That's all. If you're still with me, if this is hitting too close to home, do me a favor, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever felt like this. And while you're at it, make sure you're subscribed, because I need you to see where this goes. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories about people who gave everything and got nothing, stories that don't pretend life is fair. I started pulling back after the vacation. Not dramatically, I didn't cut Jeremy off or have some big confrontation, but I stopped being so available. When he called asking for money, I started saying I needed to check my account first, that I wasn't sure I could help. Sometimes I'd wait a day or two before responding. I wanted to see if he'd notice, if he'd ask what was wrong, if he'd sense that something had shifted. He didn't. When I said I couldn't help, he'd just move on. He'd call back a week later with a different request. And if I did help, he'd take the money and disappear again. It was like I only existed when he needed something, and the rest of the time, I was invisible. The invisibility was the hardest part. I could have handled the money if Jeremy had just been present, if he'd called to check in, if he'd invited me over for dinner, if he'd made me feel like I mattered. But he didn't. Months would go by where I wouldn't hear from him unless he wanted something. And in those months, I'd sit in my empty house and wonder what I'd done wrong. I'd replay every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out where I'd lost him. Was it something I said? Something I didn't say? Did I push too hard? Did I not push enough? Did Brooke turn him against me, or did he drift away on his own? I tortured myself with questions I'd never get answers to, because Jeremy wasn't introspective enough to have those conversations, and I wasn't brave enough to force them. But I was getting braver. Slowly. The more I pulled back, the more I started to see things clearly. I started noticing the patterns, the way Jeremy only called when he wanted something, the way Brooke's name came up more than mine in his life, the way he talked about building a future that never seemed to include me. I started realizing that I'd spent so much time trying to be the mother he needed that I'd forgotten to ask if he was the son I deserved. And the answer, as much as it hurt, was no. He wasn't. Not anymore. I started imagining what it would feel like to say no. Not just to the money, but to all of it, the guilt, the obligation, the endless one-sided effort. I imagined what it would be like to stop carrying him, to let him fall and see if he could catch himself. It scared me. Because if I stopped, what did that make me? What kind of mother gives up on her child? But then I'd think about the list in my drawer, about the $32,000, about the years of silence and distance, and I'd wonder, who gave up on who first? I didn't have an answer yet. But I was getting close. The call came on a Thursday in June, 3 months after Jeremy's beach vacation and nearly 2 years since Daniel died. I was at work, filing insurance claims and trying not to think about the fact that my paycheck was going almost entirely to bills and the small amounts I still occasionally sent to Jeremy. My phone buzzed, and when I saw his name, I felt that familiar twist in my stomach, part hope, part dread. I answered on the third ring, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't been hoping he'd call for weeks. "Hey, Mom," Jeremy said, and his voice had that tone, the one that meant he wanted something. But this time, he surprised me. Brooke and I were talking, and we realized it's been a while since we've all gotten together. "We'd like to invite you over for dinner this Saturday. Just the 3 of us. What do you think?" I should have been suspicious. I should have asked why, after months of avoidance, they suddenly wanted to see me. But I didn't. Because I was desperate. Desperate for connection, desperate to believe that maybe things were changing, that maybe Jeremy had realized how distant he'd been. I said yes immediately, maybe too quickly, because Jeremy laughed a little and said, "Okay, great. Come around 6. We'll make something nice." I spent the next 2 days in a state of anxious preparation. I bought a bottle of wine, even though I didn't know if they drank wine with dinner. I got my hair done, which I never did, because I wanted to look put together, wanted them to see that I was doing okay, that I wasn't falling apart. I picked out an outfit that was nice but not too formal, because I didn't want Brooke to think I was trying too hard. I rehearsed things to say, topics to bring up, questions to ask that would keep the conversation going without making me seem needy. I told myself this was a new beginning, that maybe we could rebuild what we'd lost. I told myself a lot of things I should have known better than to believe. Saturday came, and I drove to their apartment with the wine on the passenger seat and a knot of nerves in my chest. They lived in a part of town I rarely visited, where the buildings were newer and the cars parked outside were nicer than anything I'd ever owned. I parked on the street and walked up to their door, clutching the wine bottle like it was a shield. I knocked, and after a long moment, Jeremy opened the door. He was wearing a nice shirt, the kind he wore to work, and he smiled at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Come on in." The apartment was bigger than I'd expected. High ceilings, open floor plan, furniture that looked expensive. I could see Brooke in the kitchen, her back to me, doing something at the stove. The smell of garlic and roasting meat filled the air, and for a second, I felt a flicker of warmth. This was what I'd wanted, just a normal dinner, just time together. I handed Jeremy the wine and said something about how nice the place looked, and he said thanks, they'd just redecorated. He didn't mention that I'd helped pay for some of that furniture. He didn't mention a lot of things. Brooke turned around when I walked into the kitchen. She was wearing a dress, something simple but elegant, and her hair was done in a way that made me feel immediately underdressed. She smiled at me, but it was the same smile she always gave me, polite, distant, like she was performing hospitality rather than feeling it. "Patricia," she said, drawing out my name like it was a formality. "So glad you could make it. We're having lamb. I hope that's okay." I said it was fine, even though I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten lamb. Daniel and I could never afford it. I sat down at their dining table, which was already set with plates and glasses that matched, the kind of coordinated dinnerware that suggested they'd registered for it somewhere. Jeremy poured wine, and Brooke brought out a salad, and we started eating. The conversation was stiff at first. Jeremy talked about work, some project he was leading that I didn't fully understand. Brooke talked about a boutique she was thinking of opening, though she didn't say how they'd afford it. I talked about work, about my neighbor Gail, about the garden I'd been tending. They nodded along, but I could tell they weren't really listening. Their attention was elsewhere, like they were waiting for something. And then, about halfway through the meal, it started. Brooke set down her fork and looked at Jeremy, and something passed between them, some unspoken signal. She turned to me with that same polite smile and said, "Patricia, there's actually something we wanted to talk to you about." My stomach dropped. Of course there was. Of course this wasn't just a dinner. I should have known. I set down my own fork and tried to keep my expression neutral. "Okay," I said. "What's going on?" Jeremy leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "So, Brooke and I have been thinking a lot about our future," he said, and I noticed he didn't say our future, like I was part of it. "We're at a point where we're ready to take the next step. We want to buy a house." I nodded slowly. "That's great," I said, even though I already knew where this was going. Brooke jumped in then, her voice bright and rehearsed. "We found the perfect place. It's in a great neighborhood, good schools for when we have kids, really everything we've been looking for. The only issue is the down payment. We're a little short." She paused, watching me, and I felt like a mouse being watched by a cat. "We were hoping you might be able to help us out." There it was. The real reason for the dinner. Not because they missed me. Not because they wanted to reconnect. Because they needed money. Again. I felt something twist inside me, sharp and bitter. I looked at Jeremy, waiting for him to say something, to soften the ask, to acknowledge what he was asking for. But he just sat there, waiting for my answer like it was a foregone conclusion. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, and my voice sounded calm even though I felt like I was falling apart inside. "$20,000, Brooke said, like it was nothing. Like $20,000 was something everyone just had lying around. We'd pay you back, of course. Once we're settled." I almost laughed. $20,000. I didn't have $20,000. I didn't have $5,000. I was still trying to rebuild the emergency fund they drained for their vacation. I was still paying off the loan I'd taken out for their wedding. I was still working overtime just to keep my own bills paid. And they were sitting there, in their expensive apartment with their lamb dinner and their matching dinnerware, asking me for $20,000 like it was reasonable. I looked at Jeremy. "That's a lot of money," I said quietly. He shrugged. "I know, but you've always figured it out before. And this is important, Mom. This is our future we're talking about." "Your future," I thought. "Not mine. Never mine." I swallowed hard and said, "I need to think about it." Brooke's smile tightened. "Of course," she said, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "We just thought, since you've helped us so much already, this would be the natural next step." The natural next step. Like I was a stepping stone, something they could use to get where they wanted to go. I forced myself to smile and said, "Let me look at my finances and see what I can do." The rest of the dinner was excruciating. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't focus. I felt numb, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I nodded and smiled and ate food I couldn't taste, and all I could think about was the list in my drawer, the $32,000 I'd already given, the fact that it would never be enough. When the meal finally ended, I thanked them and said I needed to get home. Jeremy walked me to the door, and as I was leaving, he said, "Thanks for considering it, Mom. It would mean a lot to us." I got in my car and drove home, and the whole way, I felt like I couldn't breathe. $20,000. For a house I'd never be invited to, for a future that didn't include me. I thought about saying yes, about finding a way to scrape the money together, because that's what I always did. And then I thought about Gail's words, "Who are you when no one's asking you for anything?" And I realized I didn't know. I'd spent so long being the person who gave that I didn't know how to be anything else. But I was about to find out. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every possible scenario. If I gave Jeremy the $20,000, where would it come from? I could take out another loan against the house, but I was already stretched thin from the wedding loan I still hadn't paid off. I could drain what little remained in my retirement account, but that would leave me with nothing for my own future, assuming I even had one. I could work more overtime, pick up extra shifts, but I was already exhausted, already running on fumes. And for what? So Jeremy and Brooke could buy a house they'd never invite me to? So they could continue their lives while I disappeared further into the background? By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. Not the decision I thought I'd make, but the one I needed to make. I wasn't going to give them the money. I couldn't. Not because I didn't love Jeremy, I did, desperately, even when he made it impossible, but because I'd finally reached the limit of what I could sacrifice without losing myself entirely. I'd given everything I had, and it hadn't been enough. It was never going to be enough. And I couldn't keep pretending that if I just gave a little more, he'd see me, he'd come back, he'd remember who we used to be. I called Jeremy on Sunday afternoon. My hands were shaking when I dialed, but my voice was steady. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom," he said, and I could hear the expectation in his tone. "Did you think about what we talked about?" "I did," I said. "And I can't do it, Jeremy. I don't have $20,000. I've been helping you and Brooke for years, and I just don't have it anymore." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "What do you mean you don't have it? You've always had it before." "Because I took out loans," I said, and my voice cracked a little. "Because I cashed out savings and worked extra hours and went without things I needed. I can't keep doing this. I'm sorry." He sighed, the kind of sigh that said I was being difficult, that I was letting him down. "Mom, this is really important. Brooke and I have been planning this for months. We need this house. And I need to be able to pay my own bills," I said. "I need to be able to eat and keep the lights on and not worry about losing the house your father and I spent our whole lives paying for. I'm not saying I don't want to help you. I'm saying I can't." Another silence. Then, "Fine. I guess we'll figure it out ourselves." "Jeremy." "I have to go," he said, and he hung up. I sat there holding the phone, my chest tight, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. He hadn't asked if I was okay. He hadn't acknowledged anything I'd said about struggling. He'd just heard no and shut down. I should have expected it. Part of me did. But it still hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because that phone call confirmed what I'd been trying not to see. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a resource that had run dry, and now that I couldn't provide what he wanted, I was disposable. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Jeremy didn't call. He didn't text. It was like I'd ceased to exist the moment I stopped being useful. I kept my phone close anyway, checking it obsessively, hoping he'd reach out, hoping he'd say he understood, that he was sorry, that he still loved me even if I couldn't give him money. But the phone stayed quiet, and the silence became its own kind of torture. I started to wonder if this was it, if this was how our relationship would end, not with a fight or a conversation, but with me slowly fading from his life until I was just a name he mentioned occasionally, the mother he used to have. I threw myself into work. I picked up every shift I could, stayed late, came in early, did anything to avoid going home to an empty house where I'd have too much time to think. My co-workers noticed. A woman named Linda, who worked in the same department, asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just needed the hours. She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but she didn't push. I was grateful. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to say out loud that my son had discarded me because I'd finally said no. It felt too pathetic, too revealing. But the truth has a way of demanding to be seen, even when you're trying to bury it. About 3 weeks after I told Jeremy I couldn't help with the house, I ran into Gail while I was checking the mail. She took one look at me and said, "You look terrible. What's going on?" And something about the way she said it, the genuine concern in her voice, made me break. I told her everything. About the years of giving, about the $32,000, about the dinner and the request for $20,000 more, about Jeremy hanging up on me when I said no. I told her I felt like I'd failed, like I'd lost my son, like everything I'd sacrificed had been for nothing. Gail listened without interrupting, and when I was done, She shook her head slowly. Patricia, she said, you didn't lose your son. He lost you. There's a difference. She paused, looking at me hard. And you need to stop blaming yourself for his choices. You did everything a mother could do. You gave until you had nothing left. If that wasn't enough for him, that's on him, not you. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that I wasn't the one who'd failed, that I'd done enough, that Jeremy's coldness was his responsibility, not mine. But it's hard to let go of guilt when you've been carrying it for so long. Mothers aren't supposed to give up on their children. That's what we're told, what we tell ourselves. But what happens when your child gives up on you first? What happens when the person you'd die for wouldn't cross the street to see you? Nobody tells you how to survive that. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you're the only one holding a relationship together, like you're the only one trying, I need you to know something: you're not alone. And it's not your fault. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because I'm about to tell you what happened when I finally stopped trying to hold it together. Check the description box below for more stories like this one, stories that tell the truth about what happens when love isn't enough. June turned into July, and I still hadn't heard from Jeremy. I stopped checking my phone as much. I stopped hoping. I started to accept that this might be the new reality, a life where my son was a stranger, where the family I'd built was just me and memories of what used to be. I kept going to work. I kept tending the garden. I kept moving forward because that's what you do when stopping isn't an option. But there was a heaviness to everything now, a grief that sat in my chest like a stone. And then, in mid-July, my phone rang. It was Jeremy. My heart jumped despite everything, despite the weeks of silence, despite knowing I shouldn't get my hopes up. I answered, trying to sound normal. Hello. Hey, Mom, he said, and his voice was casual, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't ignored me for weeks. Brooke and I wanted to invite you to dinner again. At our place. This Friday. I should have said no. I should have asked why, should have demanded an explanation for the silence, should have protected myself from whatever this was. But I didn't. Because I was still that woman who wanted her son back, who wanted to believe things could be different. Okay, I said. What time? 7, he said. And Mom? Brooke's parents are going to be there too. It's kind of a family dinner thing. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I ignored the feeling. That sounds nice, I said, even though the thought of spending an evening with Brooke's parents, who I'd only met once at the wedding, made me anxious. Great, Jeremy said. See you Friday. And he hung up before I could say anything else. I spent the week trying not to overthink it. A family dinner. Maybe this was Jeremy's way of trying to reconnect, of including me in their lives again. Maybe he'd realized how distant he'd been. Maybe this was an olive branch. I told myself these things even though a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind kept saying, don't trust this. Don't get your hopes up. You know better. But I wanted to hope. So I did. Friday came, and I drove to their apartment with the same anxious energy I'd had the first time. I'd bought a small bouquet of flowers for Brooke, a gesture I thought might soften things. I wore a dress I'd had for years but rarely wore, something I thought looked nice without trying too hard. I felt like I was preparing for a test I didn't know how to study for. When I got to their door and knocked, Jeremy answered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey, Mom, he said. Come on in. Everyone's here. I walked into the apartment and immediately saw Brooke's parents sitting on the couch. Her father, Richard, was a tall man with silver hair and an air of self-satisfaction. Her mother, Diane, was elegant in that effortless way some women are, wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my car. They both stood when I walked in, and Richard extended his hand. Patricia, he said. Good to see you again. I shook his hand and said something polite, and Diane gave me a smile that felt like an assessment. We all sat down, and Brooke brought out drinks and appetizers, and the conversation started in that awkward, surface-level way it does when people don't really know each other. Richard talked about his work in real estate. Diane talked about a charity event she was organizing. Jeremy talked about his job. Brooke talked about the house they were still hoping to buy. I mostly listened, chiming in when it seemed appropriate, trying to find my place in the conversation. And then dinner started, and everything shifted. We sat down at the table, the 6 of us, and Brooke served some elaborate meal I couldn't have afforded to make: roasted duck, fancy vegetables, a salad with ingredients I didn't recognize. The wine flowed freely, and the conversation got louder, more animated. Richard told stories about deals he'd closed. Diane talked about their recent trip to Europe. Jeremy and Brooke laughed along, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was the outsider here. This wasn't a family dinner. This was Brooke's family dinner, and I'd been invited as an afterthought, a box to check so Jeremy could say he'd included me. About halfway through the meal, Diane turned to me with a smile that felt sharp around the edges. "Patricia," she said, "Jeremy was telling us you've been so generous with them over the years. Helping with the wedding, helping them get on their feet. That must be nice, having the means to support your children like that." I felt my face flush. Having the means. Like I was wealthy, like I'd been giving out of abundance rather than sacrifice. "I just wanted to help," I said quietly. "Of course," Diane said, and her tone was patronizing. "It's wonderful that you've been able to do that. Richard and I have helped Brooke and Jeremy as well, though we've tried to teach them financial independence. It's so important for young people to learn to stand on their own, don't you think?" The implication was clear. I'd been enabling them. I'd been making them dependent. I felt anger flare in my chest, but I swallowed it. "I think every family does what works for them," I said. Richard jumped in then. "Absolutely. Though I have to say, we were a bit surprised when Jeremy mentioned you couldn't help with the house. I mean, after everything you've done, it seemed like you'd want to see them take that next step." I stared at him. He was actually criticizing me for saying no. For finally setting a boundary. I looked at Jeremy, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, but he was looking at his plate, silent. Brooke was watching me with that same unreadable expression she always had. And I realized, they'd set this up. This whole dinner was designed to pressure me, to make me feel guilty, to manipulate me into giving them the money I didn't have. "I didn't say I didn't want to help," I said, and my voice was shaking now. "I said I couldn't. There's a difference." "Is there?" Diane said, and she tilted her head like she was genuinely curious. "Because it seems to me that if you've been able to help this much already, surely you could find a way to help with something as important as a house." I felt something snap inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. I looked around the table, at Richard and Diane with their expensive clothes and their condescending smiles, at Brooke with her cool, detached gaze, at Jeremy who still wouldn't look at me, and I saw it clearly for the first time. I wasn't family to these people. I was a wallet. And this dinner wasn't about connection. It was about extraction. And then Brooke spoke, and everything that came next started with her words. She leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine glass, and she looked at me with something like pity. "You know what I don't understand, Patricia," she said, and her voice was sweet but venomous. "You talk about family all the time. You talk about how important Jeremy is to you. But where's your husband? Where's the rest of your family?" She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Oh, right. You don't have any." The table went silent. Richard and Diane looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Jeremy, my son, my boy, laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh. A real laugh, like Brooke had said something funny. And that's when I felt it. The final thread holding me to who I used to be, snapping clean. I don't remember making the decision to speak. It felt more like the words were already there, fully formed, waiting for the right moment to break free. I looked at Brooke, at her smug expression and her wine glass and her casual cruelty, and then I looked at Jeremy, at the son I'd sacrificed everything for, who was still smiling like his wife hadn't just gutted me at their dinner table. And I felt something I'd never felt before, a cold, clarifying rage that burned away every instinct to stay quiet, to be polite, to protect his feelings at the expense of my own. I set down my fork carefully, deliberately, and I let the silence stretch until everyone was looking at me. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady in a way it had never been before. I looked directly at Brooke, and I said, "You're right. I don't have a husband anymore. He died 2 years ago of a heart attack in our driveway, and I held him while we waited for paramedics who couldn't save him. I don't have other children because I had 3 miscarriages before Jeremy, and each one nearly destroyed me. I don't have extended family because my parents died young and Daniel's family disowned him when he married me because I wasn't good enough for them. You're absolutely right, Brooke. I don't have family." I turned to Jeremy then, and I saw his smile falter, saw him start to realize where this was going. "But you know what I do have?" I continued. "Or what I did have, Until I gave it all to you. Money. $32,000 over the last 3 years, to be exact. $15,000 for your wedding. $8,000 for rent. $1,200 for Brooke's car. $3,000 for credit card debt. $2,000 for furniture. $1,500 for your vacation. And countless other small amounts I stopped keeping track of because it was easier not to know. Brooke's face had gone pale. Richard and Diane were staring at me with wide eyes. Jeremy opened his mouth to say something, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished, I said, and my voice was getting louder now, all the years of silence and swallowed hurt pouring out. You want to know where my family is, Brooke? My family is sitting right next to you. My family is the son I worked double shifts to put through college debt-free. My family is the boy I raised alone half the time because Daniel was working 3 jobs to give him opportunities we never had. My family is the man who hasn't called me in weeks unless he needed money, who hasn't asked how I'm doing, who didn't come to see me after his father died except for an hour at the funeral. I looked at Jeremy, really looked at him, and I saw tears forming in his eyes, but I couldn't stop. I'd started, and all the words I'd been choking on for years were finally free. You asked me for $20,000 for a house. Do you know where that money would have come from, Jeremy? Another loan against the house your father and I spent 39 years paying for. The house I might lose because I've given you everything I have. Do you know what I've been eating? Pasta and canned soup because that's what I can afford after sending you rent money. Do you know I haven't been to the dentist in 2 years because I couldn't afford it after helping with your credit card debt? Do you know I've been working overtime until my body aches because I'm 63 years old and I can't stop because if I stop, I can't help you, and if I can't help you, I don't exist to you anymore. The silence in that room was suffocating. Brooke was staring at her plate. Richard had his hand over his mouth. Diane looked like she wanted to disappear. And Jeremy was crying now, actually crying, but I was too far gone to care. You laughed, I said, and my voice broke. Your wife mocked me for being alone, for losing everyone I've ever loved, and you laughed. Like it was funny. Like my grief was entertainment. I stood up then, my legs shaky but holding, and I looked at Brooke. You want to know where my family is? I'll tell you where my family is. My family is dead. My husband is dead. The son I raised is gone, replaced by someone I don't recognize who only calls when he needs something. So you're right, Brooke. I don't have family. Not anymore. And then I said the words that changed everything. I looked at Jeremy, and I said, you asked me where my husband and family are. Well, let me ask you something, Jeremy. Where's your money? Where's the career you promised was taking off? Where's the financial stability you keep talking about? I paused, letting it sink in. Oh, right. You don't have any. Because I've been supporting you. I've been keeping you afloat. I've been funding your life while you treated me like an ATM with a heartbeat. But not anymore. Not after tonight. I picked up my purse, and I looked around the table one last time. The bank is closed, I said. Figure it out yourselves. And I walked out. I made it to my car before the shaking started. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the adrenaline and the anger and the grief that was threatening to drown me. I'd done it. I'd finally said everything I'd been holding back for years. I'd stood up for myself in a way I never had before. And it felt terrible. It felt like I'd just blown up my entire life, like I'd destroyed the last connection I had to the family I'd built. But it also felt necessary. It felt like survival. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the scene over and over. The look on Brooke's face. The shock in Richard and Diane's eyes. Jeremy crying. Me walking out without looking back. Part of me wanted to turn around, to apologize, to take it all back and smooth things over the way I always did. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been slowly dying every time I said yes when I should have said no, knew I couldn't. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I'd spoken a truth I couldn't unspeak. And there was no going back from this. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, staring at the house Daniel and I had bought when we were young and hopeful, before we knew how hard life would be, before we knew love sometimes wasn't enough. I thought about him, about what he'd say if he could see me now. Part of me thought he'd be disappointed, that he'd say I should have been more patient, more understanding, that family was worth fighting for. But another part of me, the The part that remembered how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed, how tired he was at the end, thought he'd understand. He'd see what I couldn't see for so long, that you can't save someone who's drowning if they keep pulling you under with them. I finally went inside, and the house felt different. Quieter. Emptier. Or maybe I was just feeling it differently, now that I'd burned the bridge I'd been so desperately trying to hold together. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table where I'd made so many meals, where I'd written so many checks, where I'd kept the list of everything I'd given away. I pulled out the list now and looked at it, all those numbers adding up to a life I couldn't get back. And I realized something: the money didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was that I'd spent years trying to buy my son's love, and it hadn't worked. It was never going to work. Because love isn't something you can purchase. It's something you give freely, or it's not love at all. My phone rang around midnight. It was Jeremy. I stared at his name on the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button, my heart pounding. I wanted to answer. God, I wanted to answer. I wanted him to say he was sorry, that he understood, that he loved me, that we could fix this. But I also knew that if I answered, I'd fall back into the same pattern, the same cycle of giving and hurting and hoping it would be different next time. So I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. And when the notification popped up that he'd left a message, I didn't listen to it. Not that night. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed watching the ceiling fan spin in the dark, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Would Jeremy apologize? Would he be angry? Would he cut me off completely? Would I ever see him again? The questions circled like vultures, and I had no answers. All I had was the knowledge that I'd finally done what I should have done years ago. I'd chosen myself. And it was terrifying. Because for so long, I'd defined myself by how much I could give, by how useful I could be, by how needed I was. Without that, who was I? I didn't know. But I was about to find out. The next morning, I listened to Jeremy's voicemail. His voice was tight, controlled, angry. Mom, what you did tonight was completely out of line. You embarrassed me and Brooke in front of her parents. You made everything about you. We invited you to be part of our family, and you threw it in our faces. I don't know what's gotten into you, but you owe us an apology. Call me back when you're ready to talk like an adult. I listened to it 3 times, and each time, I felt the anger build. He thought I owed him an apology. He thought I was the one who'd been out of line. He'd completely missed the point, or he was choosing to miss it, which was worse. He'd made me the villain in a story where I'd been the victim for years. And that's when I realized, he wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to have some epiphany and realize what he'd done. He was going to rewrite history to make himself the hurt party, to make my pain invisible, to justify why he was right and I was wrong. I didn't call him back. Days passed. Then a week. My phone stayed mostly quiet. Jeremy didn't call again. Brooke certainly didn't. I went to work, came home, existed in a strange limbo where I felt both lighter and heavier than I ever had. Lighter because I wasn't carrying the weight of constant giving anymore. Heavier because I was facing the reality that I might have lost my son for good. And I grieved. Not loudly, not dramatically, but constantly, like a low hum in the background of everything I did. I grieved the relationship I'd thought we had. I grieved the mother I'd been. I grieved the hope I'd carried that things would get better. But something else was happening too. Something unexpected. I was getting angry. Not the hot, explosive anger I'd felt at the dinner table, but a cold, clarifying fury that grew stronger every day. I started thinking about all the years I'd spent making myself small, all the times I'd apologized for things that weren't my fault, all the moments I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. I thought about Brooke's words, "Where's your husband? Where's your family? You don't have any," and I felt rage surge through me. Who the hell was she to mock my loss? Who the hell was Jeremy to laugh? And I started to wonder, what would happen if I stopped making it easy for them? What would happen if I took back the power I'd given away? I didn't have a plan yet. But I was starting to get one. 2 weeks after the dinner, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Hello. Mrs. Williamson? This is Andrea Chen from First National Bank. I'm calling about the co-signed loan on your property. We've noticed some concerning activity we need to discuss with you. My stomach dropped. Co-signed loan? I hadn't co-signed anything. I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I don't have any co-signed loans. There was a pause. According to our records, you co-signed a personal loan for $25,000 3 months ago. The first payment was due 2 weeks ago and hasn't been received. We're calling to arrange payment. My mind went blank. Then it clicked. 3 months ago. Right around the time Jeremy had started pulling away, before the dinner invitation. Can you tell me who the loan is for? The primary borrower is Jeremy Williamson. According to the application, you co-signed as the secondary guarantor. I felt like I'd been punched. Jeremy had forged my signature on a loan. He'd used my name, my credit, my house as collateral without asking, without telling me. $25,000. My hands started shaking. I need to see the paperwork, I said, my voice barely steady. Of course. I can email you copies. But Mrs. Williamson, if this payment isn't made within the next 10 days, we'll be forced to begin collection proceedings, which could include placing a lien on your property. I got off the phone and sat in stunned silence. Then I called the bank back and asked them to send everything immediately. The documents arrived in my inbox within minutes, and when I opened them, I saw it, my signature, or something that looked close enough to it, on a loan application dated March 15th. 3 months ago. A month after I'd refused to help with the house down payment. He'd done this. My son had committed fraud rather than accept that I couldn't give him what he wanted. I called him. He didn't answer. I called again. And again. On the 4th try, he picked up. What, Mom? I'm busy. The bank called, I said, and my voice was ice. About the $25,000 loan you took out in my name. Silence. Jeremy, did you forge my signature on a loan application? Look, I can explain. Did you forge my signature? I needed the money, okay? You said you couldn't help, but I knew you'd have the credit to get approved, so I was going to pay it back before you even knew about it. I couldn't breathe. You committed fraud. You put my house at risk. You could go to jail for this, Jeremy. Do you understand that? It's not that serious, he said, and he sounded annoyed, like I was overreacting. I just needed help and you wouldn't give it to me. What was I supposed to do? Not commit a crime. I was shouting now, something I never did. Not steal from me. Not put everything your father and I worked for at risk because you wanted money you didn't earn. Oh, here we go with the guilt trip, he said. I'm so sorry I'm not the perfect son who never needs anything. I'm sorry I have a life and ambitions. Not all of us want to just exist in some sad little house feeling sorry for ourselves. The cruelty of it took my breath away. The sad little house you used as collateral for your fraud. I said quietly, that sad little house. He didn't respond. You have 10 days to make that payment, I said. Or I'm going to the police and reporting identity theft. And then I'm going to the bank and showing them that I never signed that document. And you will go to jail, Jeremy. I promise you that. You wouldn't, he said, but his voice was uncertain now. Try me, I said. And I hung up. I sat there shaking, my phone clutched in my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt in the 2 weeks since the dinner, clarity. Pure, absolute clarity. This wasn't about the money anymore. This wasn't even about the years of taking advantage. This was about my son thinking so little of me that he'd commit fraud, that he'd risk my home, my security, my entire life, because he felt entitled to what I had. And I'd enabled it. Every time I'd said yes, every time I'd swallowed my hurt, every time I'd prioritized his comfort over my own survival, I'd taught him that he could do this. That I'd always be there to absorb the damage. That I didn't matter. I called a lawyer the next day. Her name was Susan Rodriguez, and she specialized in elder financial abuse. I told her everything, the years of giving, the loan, the forged signature, the dinner. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, Mrs. Williamson, what your son did is a felony. It's identity theft and fraud. You have grounds to press charges and to seek full restitution. You could also sue for the money he's taken over the years if you have documentation. I have documentation, I said, and I thought of the list in my drawer, the bank statements, the receipts. But he's my son. I don't know if I can send him to jail. I understand, Susan said gently. And you don't have to decide right now. But I need you to understand something. If you don't act, you could lose your house. You could lose everything. He's already shown he's willing to destroy you financially. What makes you think he'll stop? She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. I asked Susan to draft a letter. Not a criminal complaint, not yet. Just a letter laying out everything Jeremy had done, with copies of the forged loan documents and my bank statements showing the money I'd given over the years. A letter demanding that he make the loan payment immediately and begin paying me back for at least part of what I'd given him. And a letter making clear that if he didn't comply, I would pursue both criminal and civil action. Susan said she could have it ready in 2 days and send it via certified mail so we'd have proof he'd received it. Those 2 days were the longest of my life. I barely slept. I kept second-guessing myself, kept thinking about Jeremy as a baby, as a little boy, as the son I'd loved more than anything. I kept wondering if I was doing the right thing or if I was destroying what little remained of our relationship. But then I'd think about the forged signature, about the loan payment I couldn't afford, about the house I might lose, and the doubt would harden into resolve. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Jeremy would get it by Thursday. I didn't tell him it was coming. I didn't warn him. I just let him find out the same way I'd found out about the loan. Suddenly, without preparation, without mercy. Thursday came and went. No call. Friday morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Jeremy, and when I answered, he was shouting. "Are you insane? You sent a legal letter to my house? Brooke's freaking out. You're actually threatening to send me to jail." "Yes," I said simply. "I'm your son." "And you're a thief," I said. "You committed fraud. You forged my signature. You put my house at risk. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" "This is insane," he said. "You're being vindictive. You're punishing me because I don't grovel at your feet every time you want attention." "I'm protecting myself," I said. "Something I should have done years ago. You have 10 days to make that loan payment. 7 days now, actually, since you let 3 days pass. If you don't, I'm filing a police report." "Brooke's parents are going to hear about this," he said, like that was supposed to scare me. "Good," I said. "Maybe they'll understand why you needed their daughter to marry into a family with money, since you don't have any of your own." He hung up on me. I sat there with my phone in my hand, and I felt something close to satisfaction. Not happiness, I was too angry and hurt for happiness, but satisfaction. For the first time in years, I'd stood my ground. I'd set a boundary and held it. I'd made him face consequences for his actions. And it felt like power, like taking back something I'd given away so long ago I'd forgotten it was mine. The days that followed were tense. Jeremy didn't call again, but I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Brooke. "You're tearing this family apart. Jeremy is devastated. How can you do this to your own son?" I didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd been part of this from the beginning, had benefited from my money, had mocked me at that dinner. She didn't get to play victim now. On the 10th day, the day the loan payment was due, I checked my bank account obsessively. By noon, nothing. By 3 p.m., nothing. I called Susan and told her to prepare the police report. She said she'd have it ready by end of business and we could file first thing Monday morning. At 4:30, my phone buzzed. A notification from the bank. Payment received. $25,000. Not just the monthly payment, the entire loan, paid in full. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. He'd done it. Or someone had done it. The loan was paid. My house was safe. I called the bank to confirm, and they told me yes, the loan had been paid in full that afternoon by wire transfer from Jeremy Williamson's account. The loan was closed. I was no longer liable. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow. Because this wasn't victory. This was Jeremy paying me off to make me go away. This was him choosing the easy way out instead of facing what he'd done. This wasn't accountability. This was damage control. I called Susan and told her. She said, "Well, that's good news for your house. What do you want to do about the rest?" I thought about it. About the $32,000 I'd given over the years. About the years of being used and ignored. About the dinner where Brooke had mocked me and Jeremy had laughed. "I want him to know he doesn't get to just pay his way out of this," I said. "I want consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Susan asked. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't know yet. The loan was paid, so the immediate crisis was over. But the damage wasn't. The years of hurt weren't. The relationship I'd lost wasn't. And somewhere deep inside me, in a place I didn't know existed until that moment, I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to understand what he'd taken from me. I wanted him to hurt the way I'd been hurting. "Let me think about it," I said to Susan. "I'll call you next week." I hung up and sat in the silence of my empty house, and I realized something that probably should have scared me but didn't. I'd changed. The woman who'd walked out of that dinner 2 weeks ago wasn't the same woman sitting here now. That woman had been hurt and angry but still soft, still hoping for reconciliation. This woman, the woman I was becoming, was harder, colder. This woman understood that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes the only way to survive is to let go of the people who are drowning you. This woman was done being a victim. And this woman was just getting started. The weekend after the loan was paid, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through Jeremy's social media. I know it sounds petty, maybe even obsessive, but I needed to understand who my son had become when I wasn't looking. I needed to see the life he'd built with the money I'd given him, the life he'd chosen over having a relationship with me. I created a fake account because he'd blocked me from his real profiles months ago, something I'd noticed but hadn't confronted because I didn't want to seem needy. That should have told me everything I needed to know right there. What I found made my stomach turn. Picture after picture of Jeremy and Brooke living a life I'd paid for but would never be part of. Expensive restaurants. Weekend trips. Designer clothes. A post from 2 months ago showing Brooke's new handbag with the caption "He spoils me so much" smiling face with heart-shaped eyes and a price tag I recognized, $1,200, posted 3 days after Jeremy had called asking for rent money, claiming they were barely making it. Another post from March, a fancy dinner at a steakhouse downtown, bottles of wine on the table, the caption celebrating life's blessings, champagne glasses, dated 1 week after Daniel's death anniversary, a day Jeremy hadn't called, hadn't checked in, hadn't acknowledged at all. But what broke something in me was a post from 4 months ago. A picture of Jeremy and Brooke with her parents, all 4 of them dressed up for some event, everyone smiling. The caption read, "So grateful for the family who shows up for us, who supports our dreams, who never makes us feel guilty for wanting more. Some people give out of love. Others give to control. Grateful we know the difference. Perfect score." I read that caption 5 times, each time feeling more sick. He was talking about me. He was calling me controlling for giving him everything I had. He was praising Brooke's parents, who'd contributed a fraction of what I had, while painting me as the villain. And the comments were full of people agreeing, people I didn't know saying things like "So true, toxic family is worse than no family and good for you for setting boundaries." Jeremy had replied to one comment with "It's been hard, but we're learning that we don't owe anyone just because they help us. Real support doesn't come with strings." I sat there staring at my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Strings. He thought my love had strings attached. He thought my sacrifice was manipulation. He'd rewritten our entire history to make himself the victim of my generosity, and people were applauding him for it. He'd taken my pain, my years of giving, my grief, and he'd turned it into a narrative where I was the problem. Where I was the toxic one. Where he was the brave son escaping his controlling mother. I called Gail. It was nearly midnight, but I couldn't be alone with what I'd found. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy. "Patricia? What's wrong?" "He told everyone I'm controlling," I said, and my voice was breaking. "He made me the villain. All those years of giving, and he told people I did it to manipulate him." "Come over," Gail said immediately. "Right now. I'll make coffee." I drove to her house in my pajamas, not caring what I looked like. When she opened the door, I collapsed into her arms and cried harder than I had since Daniel died. She held me and let me sob, and when I finally pulled away, she guided me to her kitchen table and made coffee neither of us drank. I showed her the posts, the captions, the comments. She read through them silently, her expression getting darker with each swipe. "This boy needs to be taught a lesson," she finally said. "The loan's paid," I said. "What else can I do?" Gail looked at me hard. "You have documentation of everything you've given him, right? Bank statements, receipts, the loan papers, everything." "Yes." "And you have proof that he forged your signature?" "Yes." "Then you have power, Patricia. You're just too nice to use it." She leaned forward. That boy has been living off you while trash-talking you to anyone who'll listen. He's been playing victim while you actually are one. And he thinks he's gotten away with it because he paid off one loan. One loan, Patricia, out of years of taking. What are you saying I should do? I asked, even though part of me already knew. I'm saying you should stop protecting him. Stop hiding what he's done. Stop letting him control the narrative. She paused. He put your private business on social media. Maybe it's time he learned what that feels like. I should have said no. I should have been the bigger person. But I was so tired of being the bigger person, of swallowing my hurt, of protecting people who wouldn't do the same for me. How? I asked. Gail smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. You tell the truth. All of it. With proof. We spent the next hour planning. Gail was more tech-savvy than me. Her daughter had taught her social media when her grandkids were born, and she helped me create a proper account, not a fake one. Patricia Williamson, my real name, my real face. We gathered every piece of documentation I had, the bank statements showing the transfers, the wedding loan papers, the forged loan application, screenshots of Jeremy's posts about toxic family. We organized it all into a folder on my computer. And then Gail said, now you need to write it. The whole story. Everything he's done, everything you've given, everything he's said. You need to write it so anyone who reads it will understand exactly who's been toxic in this relationship. I don't know if I can, I said. Yes, you can, Gail said firmly. Because if you don't, he wins. He gets to keep lying about you. He gets to keep using you. He gets to destroy your reputation while building his. Is that what Daniel would have wanted? For you to just take it? She was right. Daniel would have been furious if he'd known what Jeremy was doing. Daniel, who'd worked himself to exhaustion for our son, who'd believed family was everything, who'd died thinking Jeremy would take care of me. Daniel wouldn't want me to stay silent. So I wrote it. I wrote it over the next 3 days, working on it every evening after work, editing and revising until every word was exactly right. I wrote about the $32,000. I wrote about the wedding loan we'd taken out against the house. I wrote about working overtime and skipping meals and cashing out retirement savings. I wrote about Daniel's death and Jeremy's absence. I wrote about the dinner where Brooke mocked me and Jeremy laughed. I wrote about the forged loan and the threat to my home. I wrote about the social media posts calling me controlling and toxic. And I attached proof of everything, bank statements with Jeremy's name and the amounts, the forged loan papers, screenshots of his posts with dates that lined up with the times he'd asked for money. The final post was 2,500 words long. It was detailed, factual, and devastating. I titled it An Open Letter to My Son, and I didn't hold anything back. This is what I wrote. To Jeremy, and to anyone who's been told I'm a controlling, toxic mother. My name is Patricia Williamson. I'm 63 years old. My husband, Daniel, died 2 years ago. We had one son together, a son we sacrificed everything for, a son we believed would remember what family meant. Over the past 3 years, I have given my son $32,000. I have attached bank statements proving every transfer. I took out loans. I cashed out savings. I worked overtime despite chronic pain. I skipped medical care. I ate less. I gave everything. In return, my son stopped calling unless he needed money. He missed his father's death anniversary. He allowed his wife to mock me for being widowed and alone. And when I finally said I couldn't give any more, he forged my signature on a $25,000 loan, putting my home at risk. I have attached the loan documents showing the forgery. But what hurt most was discovering he'd been telling people I was toxic. That my love had strings attached. That I gave to control him. I've attached screenshots of those posts. Let me be clear, I didn't give to control. I gave because I loved him. I gave because that's what parents do. I gave because I believed family meant something. I was wrong. To anyone reading this who knows my son, who's liked his posts about toxic family, who's encouraged him to cut off his controlling mother, you should know the truth. You should know that toxic mother paid for his wedding, his rent, his vacation, his life. You should know that controlling mother nearly lost her home because he committed fraud. I'm not writing this for sympathy. I'm writing it because I'm done being silent while my son rewrites history. I'm done protecting someone who won't protect me. I'm done. Jeremy, if you're reading this, you won't get another dollar from me. You won't get another sacrifice. You won't get another chance to use me and then paint me as the villain. The bank is closed. Permanently. To everyone else, be careful who you believe. Sometimes the victim isn't who you think it is. I stared at the finished post for a long time before I hit publish. My finger hovered over the button, and I thought about what would happen when I pressed it. This would be public. Permanent. Everyone would see it. Jeremy's friends, Brooke's family, people I didn't even know. There would be fallout. There would be anger. There would be consequences I couldn't predict. But staying silent had consequences too. And I was done paying for Jeremy's comfort with my own suffering. I pressed publish. Within an hour, I had 50 comments, most from people I didn't know who'd found the post through shares. This is heartbreaking. Your son should be ashamed. I'm so sorry you went through this. Some people asked for my Venmo to send me money. I declined, said that wasn't the point. A few people questioned if it was real. I responded to those with everything is documented. If anyone wants to verify, I can provide additional proof. Nobody asked for additional proof. By the next morning, the post had been shared over 300 times. People were tagging Jeremy in the comments, demanding he respond. His original post about toxic family was being flooded with comments from strangers calling him out, asking how he could treat his mother this way. Brooke had made her account private. Richard and Diane, Brooke's parents, had apparently seen it too, because someone commented that they'd heard Richard was mortified at his daughter's behavior at the dinner. My phone started ringing. Unknown numbers, all of them. I didn't answer. A few people I'd known from Jeremy's childhood, parents of his friends from school, our old neighbors, reached out through Facebook with messages of support. I always thought you were such a dedicated mother. I had no idea he'd treated you this way. If you need anything, please let us know. And then, on the third day after I posted it, Jeremy called. I almost didn't answer. But I needed to hear what he'd say. I needed to know if he'd finally understand what he'd done. How could you? He said when I answered. His voice was shaking, furious. How could you put all our private business out there? Do you know what people are saying? Do you know how humiliated Brooke is? Her parents are questioning everything. My friends are asking if I really forged a loan. Everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. Are you? I asked quietly. What? A monster. You forged my signature. Jeremy. You put my house at risk. You took $32,000 from me and then told people I was toxic for giving it to you. You let your wife mock me for being widowed. So I'm asking, are you a monster, or just someone who doesn't care who he hurts as long as he gets what he wants? You made me look terrible, he shouted. I told the truth, I said. With documentation. If the truth makes you look terrible, that's not my problem. Take it down, he demanded. Take it down right now or I swear to God. Or what? I interrupted. You'll cut me off? You already did that. You'll stop calling? You never called anyway unless you wanted money. You'll tell people I'm toxic. You already did that too. What exactly do you think you can threaten me with, Jeremy? I have nothing left to lose. You already took it all. There was a long silence. Then, quieter, Mom, please. This is destroying my life. Good, I said, and I meant it. Maybe now you'll understand what it felt like when you destroyed mine. I hung up. And I didn't take the post down. If you've been following this story, if you've made it this far, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about people who finally fought back, who finally chose themselves, who finally stopped being silent. Because silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you easier to hurt. The post stayed up. The shares kept coming. And my son learned, maybe for the first time in his life, that actions have consequences. That you can't use people forever. That eventually, even the quietest woman will find her voice. And when she does, she won't whisper. The week after my post went viral, and I used that word deliberately, because within 5 days it had been shared over 1,000 times, my entire life changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some changes were good. Many were complicated. A few were devastating. But all of them were necessary. The first unexpected consequence was that other people started sharing their own stories. In the comments of my post, on their own pages, in private messages to me, People I'd never met started telling me about their own experiences with family members who'd used them, taken from them, painted them as villains when they finally said no. A woman named Helen from Ohio sent me a message about her daughter who'd stolen her identity and maxed out credit cards in her name. A man named Robert from Florida told me about his son who'd borrowed money for medical emergencies that turned out to be gambling debts. A woman named Margaret from right here in my own state told me she'd given her grandson $50,000 over 10 years and had been called selfish when she couldn't afford to give more. I read every message. I responded to as many as I could. And I realized something profound. This wasn't just my story. This was the story of countless parents, mostly mothers, who'd been taught that sacrifice was love, that giving until you broke was what good parents did, that setting boundaries with your children made you selfish. We'd all been drowning in silence, believing we were alone, believing we were the only ones who'd failed. But we weren't alone. We were an army of quiet women who'd finally started speaking. The second consequence was that my son's world began to crumble in ways I hadn't intended but couldn't bring myself to feel sorry about. A mutual friend, someone who'd known Jeremy since high school, reached out to tell me that Jeremy's boss had seen the post. Apparently, someone at his company had shared it, and word had gotten around the office. The friend said Jeremy was being looked at differently now, that people were questioning his character, that there was talk of whether someone who'd commit fraud against his own mother could be trusted with company finances. I didn't know if that would lead anywhere, but the seed had been planted. Brooke's boutique dream died. I heard through the grapevine, and yes, I'll admit I was listening to the grapevine now, something I'd never done before, that her parents had been considering investing in her business idea. After the post, after learning what had happened at that dinner, they pulled out. Diane apparently told someone else who eventually told Gail, who told me that she was horrified by Brooke's behavior, that she didn't raise her daughter to treat people that way, and that she couldn't in good conscience support a business venture for someone who'd shown such cruelty. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that. Not because I wanted Brooke to fail, but because I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't mock someone's grief and walk away unscathed. The third consequence was the hardest. 2 weeks after the post, I got a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual physical letter, delivered by certified mail. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, my hands were shaking. The letter was on behalf of Jeremy and Brooke. It was a cease and desist, demanding that I remove the post immediately, claiming it was defamatory, that it had caused them severe emotional distress and reputational harm, and that if I didn't comply within 10 days, they would pursue legal action including a lawsuit for damages. I called Susan, my lawyer, immediately. She read the letter over the phone and then laughed, actually laughed. "They don't have a case," she said. "Everything you posted is true and you have documentation. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. They're trying to scare you into taking it down." "Will they actually sue?" I asked. "They might, but they won't win. And honestly, Patricia, if they're stupid enough to sue, it'll just bring more attention to what they did. It'll make them look worse. This letter is a bluff." "What should I do?" "Ignore it," Susan said. "Or better yet, respond through me. I'll write them a letter explaining why they don't have a case and suggesting they reconsider wasting money on a lawsuit they'll lose. I'll make it very clear that you have no intention of removing the post and that you're prepared to defend yourself if necessary." Susan sent the response the next day. I never heard back from Jeremy's lawyers. Whether that meant they realized they couldn't win or Jeremy couldn't afford to pursue it, I didn't know. Either way, the post stayed up. But the letter had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Because it meant Jeremy had gone from being ashamed and angry to being vindictive. It meant he wasn't going to apologize or try to make things right. He was going to fight me. And somewhere in the part of me that still loved the boy he used to be, that hurt in a way nothing else had. Gail noticed. She came over one evening with takeout neither of us had ordered. She'd just shown up with Chinese food and a bottle of wine and a look that said we were going to talk whether I wanted to or not. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd written the post, where I'd kept the list of everything I'd given, where I'd sat alone so many nights wondering if I'd done something wrong. "You're second-guessing yourself," Gail said. "It wasn't a question." "He tried to sue me," I said quietly. "My own son tried to sue me for telling the truth." "And that tells you everything you need to know about who he's become," Gail said. "Patricia, listen to me. You did the right thing. You stood up for yourself. You refused to be silenced. That's not wrong. That's survival." But what if I've destroyed any chance of us ever? Ever what? Gail interrupted. Ever going back to the way things were? You mean where you give everything and he takes it and treats you like garbage? Where you sacrifice and he mocks you? Where you break yourself trying to buy his love and it never works? She reached across the table and took my hand. That relationship was already destroyed, Patricia. You didn't kill it. You just stopped pretending it was alive. I started crying then, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, where your whole body shakes. I don't know who I am without him, I said between sobs. For 40 years, I've been his mother. That's who I was. And now I don't know what I'm supposed to be. You're supposed to be Patricia, Gail said firmly. Not Jeremy's mother. Not Daniel's wife. Just Patricia. And maybe it's time you figured out who that is. She was right, but that didn't make it easier. Because figuring out who you are after decades of defining yourself through other people is terrifying. It's like learning to walk again after a catastrophic injury. Every step hurts, every movement feels wrong, and you're constantly afraid you're going to fall. But you do it anyway, because the alternative is never moving again. So I started trying. I started small. I joined a book club at the library that met twice a month. I hadn't read a book for pleasure in years. There'd never been time, never been money for anything beyond necessities. But I checked out novels from the library, free, and I read them. I discovered I liked mysteries, the kind where ordinary people solve crimes, where justice wins in the end even when it seems impossible. I wondered if that meant something about my own need for justice, for things to work out right. Probably. But I read them anyway. I started walking in the mornings, longer than before. Not just around the block, but to the park near my house, where there was a trail that wound around a small pond. I'd watch people there, young mothers with strollers, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers playing frisbee, and I'd think about all the years I'd missed doing things like this because I was always working, always giving, always too tired. I'd wasted so much time. But I was trying not to waste any more. I started saying yes to invitations I would have declined before. Linda from work asked if I wanted to grab dinner. Before, I would have said no, would have made an excuse about being tired or busy. This time I said yes. We went to a casual Italian place and talked for 3 hours. She told me about her divorce, about her kids who barely called, about feeling invisible in her own life. I told her about Jeremy, about the post, about trying to figure out who I was now. And we sat there, 2 women in our 60s, comparing scars and realizing we weren't alone. It helped more than I can explain. But Jeremy was still a wound that wouldn't heal. A month after the post, after the cease and desist letter, after the silence that stretched between us like a chasm, I drove past the house he and Brooke had wanted to buy. The for sale sign was still up. They hadn't gotten it. Maybe they couldn't get approved for the mortgage without my co-signature. Maybe they couldn't afford it without my help. I didn't know and I told myself I didn't care. But I cried the whole drive home anyway. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about setting boundaries, about standing up for yourself, about refusing to be used. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel empowering. It feels like grief. It feels like you've amputated part of yourself, and even though that part was toxic, even though removing it was necessary for survival, you still mourn it. You still feel the phantom pain of what used to be there, even when what used to be there was killing you. I mourned. I mourned the son I'd thought I had. I mourned the relationship I'd believed would always repair. I mourned the future I'd imagined where Jeremy would eventually understand, would eventually apologize, would eventually become the man I'd raised him to be. That future was dead. I'd killed it when I posted the truth. And even though it needed to die, even though it was built on fantasy and false hope, I grieved it. But I also started to feel something else. Something smaller but more solid. Something that felt like the first shoots of new growth after a forest fire. I started to feel proud of myself. Not all the time, not consistently, but in moments. Moments when I realized I'd gone a whole day without checking Jeremy's social media. Moments when someone from the book club called me to chat and I had a friend, a real friend, not just someone I was related to by obligation. Moments when I looked at my bank account and saw that for the first time in 3 years, I had a savings account with an actual balance, money I hadn't given away, money that was mine. I started to feel like maybe Gail was right. Maybe I could figure out who Patricia was. Maybe I was already figuring it out. Maybe the woman I was becoming, harder, yes, but also stronger, was someone I could learn to like. And then, 6 weeks after the post, Something happened that I didn't expect. I got a message on Facebook from Richard, Brooke's father. It was brief and formal. "Patricia, I wonder if we might speak privately. I believe there are things you deserve to know. Please call me at your convenience." He left his number. I stared at that message for an hour before I called Susan and asked what I should do. She said it was my choice, but that if I did speak with him, I should be cautious, maybe record the conversation if it was legal in my state. It was single-party consent. So I called him back that evening, my hand shaking as I dialed, my phone set to record. "Patricia," Richard answered on the first ring. "Thank you for calling. I imagine you're surprised to hear from me." "That's an understatement," I said carefully. He sighed. "I'll get to the point. Diane and I had a long conversation with Brooke after your post. We asked her to explain what happened at that dinner, to tell us her side. And then we asked Jeremy for his side. And Patricia, the more we learned, the more disgusted we became." I stayed silent, afraid to hope this was going where it seemed to be going. "We didn't know the extent of what you'd given them," Richard continued. "We knew you'd helped with the wedding, but we had no idea about the rest. And when Brooke admitted what she'd said to you, when Jeremy admitted he'd forged your signature on that loan. Patricia, I'm calling to apologize. On behalf of my family. What they did was unconscionable. And I'm ashamed that my daughter was part of it." I felt tears starting. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserved better," he said simply. "Because Diane and I raised Brooke to be better than that, and we failed somewhere. And because—" He paused. "Because we've cut them off. Financially and otherwise. We told them we can't support people who would treat a parent the way they treated you. So they're on their own now. Truly on their own." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad for Jeremy, despite everything. Part of me just felt tired. "I don't know if that means anything to you," Richard said. "But I wanted you to know. And I wanted you to know that if you'd like to pursue legal action for the money they took, Diane and I would be willing to testify about what they've admitted to us." We talked for another 20 minutes. Richard told me that Jeremy and Brooke had been living beyond their means for years, funded by me and occasional help from him and Diane, but mostly by me. He told me that Brooke had been the one pushing for the house, for the lifestyle, for the appearances, and Jeremy had been too weak to say no. He told me that their marriage was apparently in trouble now, that the stress of being cut off by everyone was making them turn on each other. And he told me, in a moment of stark honesty, that he wasn't sure Jeremy was capable of taking responsibility for what he'd done, that some people go their whole lives blaming others for their own failures. When I got off the phone, I sat in my kitchen in the dark for a long time. I thought about Jeremy at 8 years old, crying because he'd lost a soccer game, and me telling him it was okay, that he'd do better next time. I thought about Jeremy at 16, sullen and angry because we couldn't afford to buy him a car like his friends had. I thought about Jeremy at 23, accepting his college diploma, and me thinking all the sacrifice had been worth it. I thought about Jeremy at 38, forging my signature, lying to me, letting his wife mock me. At what point had I lost him? Or had I never really had him at all? Had I loved a version of him that only existed in my head, a fantasy son who would eventually appreciate everything I'd done? Had I spent 40 years loving someone who didn't exist? I didn't have answers. Maybe I never would. But sitting there in the dark, I made a decision. I wasn't going to pursue legal action. I wasn't going to sue for the $32,000. Not because Jeremy deserved mercy, but because I deserved peace. I deserved to close this chapter and move on. The post had already accomplished what I needed. It had told the truth, it had taken back my narrative, it had shown me I could stand up for myself. The rest was just punishment for punishment's sake, and I was too tired for that. I wanted to be free. And you can't be free while you're still fighting. So I let it go. Not the hurt, that would take longer. Not the anger, that was still there, simmering under the surface. But the need for revenge, for him to suffer more, for justice to look like something specific. I let that go. And slowly, painfully, I started to heal. 3 months after the post, fall arrived, and with it came a different kind of quiet. Not the suffocating silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of a life being rebuilt. The leaves turned gold and red, and I spent my weekends raking them into piles in my front yard, something Daniel used to do, something I'd never had the energy or time for in the years since he died. My neighbors' kids would come over and jump in the piles, and I'd watch them laugh and remember when Jeremy was that age, when everything was simpler, before money and resentment had poisoned everything. The book club became a regular part of my life. We met every other Wednesday evening at the library, and I found myself looking forward to those meetings in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in years. The group was mostly women my age or older, and we'd talk about the books we'd read, but we'd also talk about our lives, our struggles, our victories. They knew my story, most of them had seen the post or heard about it, but they didn't treat me like a victim or a cautionary tale. They treated me like Patricia, like a person who was more than her trauma, and that meant everything. One woman in the group, a retired teacher named Dorothy, became a real friend. She was 70, sharp as a tack, and didn't suffer fools. She divorced her husband 30 years ago after discovering he'd been embezzling from the school where she taught, and she'd rebuilt her life from scratch. She understood what it meant to love someone who turned out to be different than you thought, what it meant to choose yourself when everyone expected you to keep sacrificing. We started meeting for coffee between book club meetings, and those conversations became a kind of therapy, a space where I could say things I couldn't say anywhere else. Do you ever regret it? I asked her once. Leaving your husband, going public with what he'd done, starting over. Dorothy stirred her coffee slowly, thinking. I regret that it was necessary, she finally said. I regret that he put me in a position where I had to choose between protecting him and protecting myself. But no, I don't regret the choice I made. Because the alternative was disappearing. And I decided I'd rather be alone than invisible. That resonated with me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I'd rather be alone than invisible. That's what I'd been for years, invisible to my own son, existing only when he needed something, disappearing the rest of the time. And I'd chosen visibility, even though it cost me the relationship I'd been desperately trying to hold on to. I'd chosen to be seen, even if it meant being seen as someone who'd given up on her child. Because the truth was, he'd given up on me first. And you can't save a relationship that only one person wants. Work became more bearable too. Not because the work itself changed, but because I changed how I approached it. I stopped taking every available overtime shift. I stopped saying yes to covering for coworkers who called in sick. I started using my vacation days, something I hadn't done since Daniel died. I took a long weekend in October and drove to the mountains, stayed in a cheap motel, and hiked trails I'd never seen before. It was the first vacation I'd taken alone in my life, and it was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I ate dinner by myself in a diner where nobody knew me, where I wasn't Jeremy's mother or Daniel's widow, where I was just a woman eating meatloaf and reading a book. It was ordinary. It was perfect. But Jeremy's absence was still a weight I carried. There were moments, birthdays, holidays, random Tuesday afternoons, where I'd think about calling him, where I'd imagine what I'd say if he answered. I'd imagine him apologizing, really apologizing, taking responsibility for what he'd done. I'd imagine us finding a way back to each other, different than before, but still connected. And then I'd remember the cease and desist letter, the social media posts calling me toxic, the forged signature, and the fantasy would dissolve. Because reconciliation requires both people to want it, to work for it. And Jeremy didn't want it. He wanted me to disappear so he could continue his life without the inconvenience of guilt. The holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving came, the first major holiday since the post, and I spent it with Gail and her family. Her daughter and grandchildren were there, and they welcomed me with warmth I hadn't expected. We ate turkey and stuffing and pumpkin pie, and I helped Gail's daughter with the dishes while the kids watched football with Gail's son-in-law. It was loud and chaotic and nothing like the quiet Thanksgivings Daniel and I used to have with just Jeremy. And I cried in Gail's bathroom at one point, overwhelmed by the kindness of being included in someone else's family when I no longer had my own. Gail found me after dinner, handed me a glass of wine, and sat down next to me on her back porch. "You did good today," she said. "I cried in your bathroom," I said. "That's what bathrooms are for," Gail said with a small smile. "Well, that and other things. But mainly for crying when you need to." I laughed despite myself. I kept thinking about Jeremy. About what he's doing today, if he's with Brooke's family, if he thought about me at all. "He probably did think about you," Gail said. "And he probably felt guilty. And then he probably pushed it down and pretended everything was fine because that's what people like him do. They don't deal with their feelings. They just avoid them." "Do you think he'll ever reach out?" I asked. It was a question I'd been afraid to voice, afraid of the answer. Gail was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I don't know. Some people come around. Some people don't. But Patricia, you can't live your life waiting for him to come around. You can't put your healing on hold hoping he'll change. You have to build a life that's full without him, and if he ever does reach out, if he ever does the work to make amends, then you can decide if there's room for him in that life. But you can't leave a space empty waiting for him to fill it. That's just another way of making yourself small. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. Still, I was trying. Every day, I was trying to build a life that didn't revolve around the hole Jeremy had left. Some days were easier than others. Christmas was approaching, and I dreaded it. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday. The decorating, the baking, the gift-giving. Daniel and I used to make a whole production of it, even when money was tight. We'd put up the tree the day after Thanksgiving, play carols while we decorated, make hot chocolate from scratch. And Jeremy, when he was little, would be so excited he could barely sleep Christmas Eve. I'd stay up late wrapping presents, and Daniel would assemble whatever toy required assembly, and we'd collapse into bed exhausted and happy, knowing that in the morning Jeremy's face would light up with joy. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. Some other Patricia in some other life where things had turned out differently. I decided I wasn't going to put up a tree this year. What was the point? It was just me, and a tree felt like a monument to everything I'd lost. But Dorothy had other ideas. She showed up at my house 2 weeks before Christmas with a small artificial tree, the kind you could set on a table, and a bag of ornaments from the dollar store. "We're decorating," she announced, marching into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "Dorothy, I don't care what you don't," she interrupted. "You're not spending Christmas in this house with no decorations feeling sorry for yourself. You're going to put up this ridiculous little tree, and you're going to hang these cheap ornaments, and you're going to remember that Christmas isn't about who's missing. It's about who's here. And I'm here. And Gail's here. And the book club is here. So we're decorating." I started to argue, but then I looked at her face, determined, caring, refusing to let me sink, and something broke open in my chest. I started crying, standing there in my living room holding a plastic bag of dollar store ornaments, and Dorothy pulled me into a hug and let me sob on her shoulder. "I miss him," I said between gasps. "I miss my son. I miss who he used to be. I miss my husband. I miss having a family. I miss not being alone." "I know," Dorothy said, rubbing my back. "I know you do. And it's okay to miss them. It's okay to grieve. But you're not alone, Patricia. You have people who care about you. Maybe not the people you thought you'd have, but people nonetheless. And we're not going anywhere." We decorated the little tree that afternoon. It was ridiculous looking, honestly, barely 2 feet tall with mismatched ornaments that were clearly cheap. But when we plugged in the lights and they twinkled in my living room window, it felt like something. Not joy, not yet. But maybe hope. Maybe the beginning of finding ways to celebrate life even when life had broken your heart. The book club decided to do a gift exchange, and I drew Linda's name. I agonized over what to get her, wanting it to be meaningful but not too expensive. I was still rebuilding my savings, still cautious about money. I finally settled on a nice journal and a fancy pen, remembering that she'd mentioned wanting to start writing down family stories before she forgot them. When we exchanged gifts at our December meeting, Linda opened hers and her eyes filled with tears. "This is perfect," she said. "How did you know?" "You mentioned it once," I said. I remembered. "People don't usually remember," Linda said quietly, and I understood what she meant. People don't usually pay attention, don't usually listen closely enough to remember the small things. I'd spent so many years not being listened to, not being remembered, that I'd become hyper-aware of doing it for others. It was a gift that came from pain, but it was still a gift. I spent Christmas Day with Dorothy and her adult son, who lived in the next town over. It was quiet and pleasant, nothing like the Christmases of my past, but good in its own way. We ate ham and watched old movies and didn't talk about anything heavy. Dorothy's son, Michael, was divorced and seemed to understand something about rebuilding your life after loss. He told me about his ex-wife, about the custody battles, about learning to be okay with seeing his kids every other weekend instead of every day. "You learn to find joy in the spaces they leave," he said. "Not the same joy, maybe, but still joy." I thought about that a lot in the days after Christmas. Finding joy in the spaces they leave. It felt impossible and necessary at the same time. Jeremy had left a massive space, a crater really, and I was supposed to find joy there. But maybe that wasn't quite what Michael meant. Maybe he meant finding joy in the spaces around the crater, in the parts of your life that aren't defined by the loss. Building something new that doesn't depend on what used to be. January came, and with it the 2-year anniversary of Daniel's death. I visited his grave on a Tuesday morning before work, the ground frozen and the sky grey. I brought flowers even though they'd die in the cold, because the gesture mattered more than the practicality. I stood there for a long time, talking to him the way I had in the months after he died, telling him everything that had happened with Jeremy, everything I'd done, everything I was trying to become. I don't know if you'd be proud of me, I said to the headstone. I don't know if you'd think I did the right thing or if you'd say I gave up too easily. But I couldn't keep drowning, Daniel. I couldn't keep losing myself trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. I hope you understand. I hope wherever you are, you can see that I'm trying. I'm trying so hard to be okay without you, without him, without the life we planned. It's not the life I wanted, but I'm trying to make it a life worth living anyway. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, and I pulled my coat tighter. I kissed my fingers and pressed them to Daniel's name carved in stone, and then I walked back to my car and drove to work. I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying. I was tired of tears. I wanted to move forward, even if I didn't know exactly where forward was. February brought an unexpected development. I was at the grocery store, pushing my cart through the produce section, when I ran into someone I hadn't seen in over a year. Sandra, Jeremy's ex-girlfriend from college. They'd dated for 2 years before he met Brooke, and I'd always liked Sandra. She was kind, down-to-earth, the kind of girl I'd hoped Jeremy would end up with. But they'd broken up, and a year later he'd met Brooke, and that had been that. Mrs. Williamson. Sandra said, her face lighting up with recognition. Oh my goodness, how are you? We made small talk for a few minutes. She was engaged now, working as a nurse at the hospital downtown, doing well. And then she said, I saw your post. About Jeremy. Her expression shifted to something like sympathy mixed with vindication. I'm sorry you went through all that. But I'm not surprised. I blinked. You're not. Sandra glanced around, then lowered her voice. Jeremy and I broke up because he borrowed money from me, almost $3,000, and never paid it back. He said it was for textbooks and emergencies, but I found out later he'd spent it on a spring break trip with his friends. When I confronted him, he got angry, said I was being petty about money, that I didn't understand how stressful his life was. We fought, and he broke up with me, made it seem like I was the problem for asking for my money back. She paused. I never told anyone because I was embarrassed. But when I saw your post, I realized he'd been doing this his whole adult life. And I'm sorry you were dealing with it on a much bigger scale. I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't new behavior. This wasn't something Brooke had taught him or something that had developed recently. This was who Jeremy was. Who he'd maybe always been, and I'd been too close to see it. Or maybe I had seen it and made excuses, the way parents do, telling myself he was young, he'd grow out of it, he just needed time. Thank you for telling me, I said to Sandra. It helps, somehow, knowing it wasn't just me. We exchanged numbers, promised to get coffee sometime, and I meant it. As I finished my shopping, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, confirmation that I'd made the right choice. Not just standing up to Jeremy, but recognizing that the problem wasn't me. The problem was him. And I couldn't fix him. I'd never been able to fix him. The rest of February passed quietly. I went to work, went to book club, had coffee with Dorothy and Gail. I started volunteering at a local food bank on Saturday mornings, packing boxes for families in need. It felt good to help people, to give in a way that was healthy, where boundaries were clear and expectations were reasonable. Nobody at the food bank took advantage of me. Nobody at the food bank made me feel small. I was just Patricia, a volunteer who showed up and did her part. March came, and with it Jeremy's 36th birthday. I thought about him all day, remembered the day he was born, the first time I held him, how perfect he'd seemed, how full of potential. I wondered if he thought about me on his birthday, if he remembered all the parties I'd thrown, all the cakes I'd baked, all the effort I'd put into making his day special. Probably not. Or if he did, he probably resented it. saw it as another example of me trying to control him with kindness. I didn't send a card. I didn't call. I didn't reach out. His birthday came and went, and I survived it, and that felt like its own kind of victory. And then, 3 days after his birthday, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mom. Jeremy's voice, uncertain, smaller than I'd heard it in years. My heart stopped. Jeremy. He paused, and I could hear him breathing, could imagine him gathering courage or maybe just working out what to say. I know I don't have the right to call. I know I probably shouldn't. But I needed to, I wanted to. Another pause. Brooke and I are getting divorced. I sat down. I didn't say anything, just waited. It's been bad for a while, he continued. Since everything happened. Since your post and her parents cutting us off, and it's just been really bad. And we finally admitted it's not working. So we're separating. Divorce will be final in a few months. I'm sorry, I said automatically, because that's what you say, even when you're not sure if you're sorry or not. Are you? Jeremy asked, and his voice had an edge to it. You never liked her. That's not true, I said. I didn't know her well enough to like or dislike her. But I saw how she treated me, and I didn't like that. Silence. Then, she said terrible things about you after the post. Blamed you for everything. Said you destroyed our lives because you were jealous and bitter. Did you defend me? I asked. More silence. Then, quietly, no. Not at first. And later? Later I started seeing things differently. Started realizing that maybe. He trailed off. That maybe what? I prompted. That maybe you weren't wrong. About all of it. His voice cracked. Mom, I'm not calling to ask for anything. I'm not calling to ask for money or help or, I'm just calling because I wanted you to know. That I'm sorry. That I was wrong. That I took advantage of you and I let Brooke treat you terribly and I forged that loan and I was a terrible son. And I'm sorry. I felt tears starting, but I kept my voice steady. Thank you for saying that. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jeremy rushed on. I don't expect anything. I just needed to say it. I needed you to know that I know what I did. And I'm sorry. We sat in silence for a long moment, the phone line crackling slightly between us. I had so many things I wanted to say, so many questions, so many years of hurt that wanted to pour out. But what came out instead was, what do you need, Jeremy? What do you mean? You're getting divorced. You're probably struggling financially. Are you living somewhere safe? Do you have food? Mom, I'm not calling for. I know, I interrupted. I'm asking anyway. Are you okay? He was quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with tears. I'm staying with a friend. I'm okay. I have a job. I'm eating. I'm managing. Okay, I said. That's good. Mom, I really am sorry. For everything. I believe you, I said. And I did. I could hear it in his voice, the genuine remorse, the recognition of what he'd done. It didn't erase the damage. It didn't undo the years of hurt. But it was something. It was a start. Can I? Jeremy hesitated. Can I call you again sometime? Not right away, but maybe in a few weeks. I'd like to, I don't know, maybe we could talk more. I thought about it. Thought about the risks, about the possibility that this was temporary, that he might fall back into old patterns. Thought about the progress I'd made, the life I'd built without him. Thought about Gail's words, you can't leave a space empty waiting for him to fill it. You can call, I finally said. But Jeremy, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was. I'm not going to go back to giving you everything while you take and take. If we rebuild a relationship, it has to be different. Equal. Respectful. Do you understand? Yes, he said immediately. Yes, I understand. I don't want it to be like before either. I want to know you. Actually know you, not just see you as someone who helps me. I want to be better. Then call me in a few weeks, I said. And we'll see. We said goodbye, and I sat holding the phone for a long time after he hung up. I felt a complicated mix of emotions, hope, caution, grief, possibility. I didn't know if Jeremy would follow through. I didn't know if this apology would lead to real change or if it was just guilt talking, temporary and fragile. But I knew one thing: I was strong enough now to handle whatever came next. If Jeremy did the work, if he truly changed, I was open to rebuilding. But if he didn't, I would survive. I had a life now that didn't depend on him. I had friends, purpose, self-respect. I had myself. And that was enough. I called Dorothy and told her about the conversation. She listened carefully, and when I was done, she said, "How do you feel?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Hopeful? Scared? Both." "That sounds about right," Dorothy said. "Just remember, Patricia, you get to set the terms now. You get to decide what you're willing to accept, what boundaries you need, what the relationship looks like if there's going to be one at all. You're not the same woman who gave him everything. You're the woman who learned to choose herself. Don't forget that." "I won't," I promised. And I meant it. The weeks that followed were cautious and slow. Jeremy called twice more, both times just to talk, not to ask for anything. We had careful conversations about surface things: his job, my volunteer work, the weather. We were like strangers getting to know each other, which in a way, we were. The mother he'd known was gone. The son I'd thought I had was gone. We were two different people trying to figure out if there was a relationship to be built from the ruins of the old one. It was exhausting and hopeful in equal measure. I didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in years, I was okay with not knowing. I'd learned to live with uncertainty, to build a life that didn't collapse when things didn't go as planned. I'd learned to be Patricia. Not Jeremy's mother. Not Daniel's widow. Just Patricia. And Patricia was going to be okay. Approx. 3,100 words. # epilogue. 1 year later. It's been a year since the dinner that changed everything. A year since I walked out of Jeremy's apartment and decided I was done being invisible. A year since I wrote that post and watched my private pain become public truth. And I'm sitting here now, in my kitchen at the same table where so much of this story unfolded, trying to make sense of where I am and how I got here. Jeremy and I talk once a week now. Sunday afternoons. Usually. The conversations are still careful, still bounded by the awareness that trust is something you rebuild slowly, stone by stone. He's been in therapy for 8 months, his choice, not something I asked for, and he's starting to understand the patterns that led him to treat me the way he did. The entitlement. The inability to see me as a full person rather than a resource. The way he'd learned to manipulate guilt to get what he wanted. He doesn't make excuses anymore, and I appreciate that. He just acknowledges what he did and works on being different. We had coffee together last month. In person. The first time I'd seen him in over a year. It was awkward at first, both of us uncertain how to navigate physical space when we'd only been talking on the phone. But we sat in a quiet cafe, and we talked for 2 hours, and it felt like maybe there was something to build on. He asked about my life, really asked, wanted to know about book club and volunteering and Dorothy and Gail. He told me about his job, about the apartment he was renting, about learning to budget and cook and do all the things he'd never had to do when I was funding his life. "I didn't realize how much I didn't know," he said at one point. "How to take care of myself, how to be an actual adult. You and Dad did everything for me, and I thought that was just how life worked. That someone would always be there to catch me. And now?" I asked. "Now I'm learning that nobody owes me that. That if I want help, I have to deserve it. And I have to be willing to give it back." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. I'm sorry it took losing you to figure it out. I didn't have easy forgiveness to offer. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single moment. It's a process, something you work toward, something that might never be complete. But I could offer him the truth. I'm glad you're figuring it out now. Even if I wish it had been sooner." Brooke is out of the picture entirely. The divorce finalized 6 months ago, and Jeremy said she moved to another state, back near her parents. He doesn't talk about her much, and I don't ask. That chapter is closed, and I'm content to let it stay that way. The post is still up. Every few weeks, someone new finds it and shares it, and I get messages from people telling me their own stories of being used by family, of finally standing up for themselves, of learning that saying no doesn't make you a bad person. I respond when I can, offering whatever support or understanding I'm able to give. It's become something bigger than just my story. It's become a touchstone for people who need to know they're not alone in their pain, that they're not wrong for setting boundaries, that they deserve better. Some people have criticized me for it. I've gotten messages calling me vindictive, saying I should have handled it privately, that airing family business online is cruel. I understand their perspective, but I don't regret it. Because staying silent was killing me, and speaking up saved me. Sometimes you have to be willing to look like the villain to stop being the victim. My life is different now in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago. I still work, but I cut back my hours slightly. I'm 64 now, and I'm planning to retire in a couple of years. I've saved more money in the past year than I did in the previous 5, and it's not because I'm making more, it's because I'm not giving it all away. I have a small but steady emergency fund. I paid off the wedding loan. I'm building toward a retirement that might actually include things I want to do, places I want to see. The book club is still a cornerstone of my life. We've expanded to meeting weekly now, and we've moved from just discussing books to sometimes just gathering to talk, to support each other, to be community for women who understand what it's like to rebuild yourself after loss. Dorothy and I are planning a trip together next spring. Nothing extravagant, just a week at a lake house she found for rent, somewhere quiet where we can read and walk and just exist without obligation. Gail remains my closest friend, the person who saw me at my lowest and refused to let me stay there. She's the one I call when I'm having a hard day, when the grief of losing the son I thought I had threatens to overwhelm me. And she's the one who reminds me, gently but firmly, that I did what I had to do, that I'm not responsible for fixing Jeremy, that I'm allowed to have a life that's my own. I've started dating, which feels both absurd and hopeful. His name is Robert, he's 67, a retired teacher who lost his wife 5 years ago. We met at the library, he's in a different book club that meets on the same night as mine, and we started talking one evening while waiting for our respective groups to start. We've been on 6 dates so far. Nothing serious yet, maybe nothing will be serious, but it's nice to have someone to go to dinner with, to talk to about books and life and the strangeness of starting over in your 60s. He knows my story, everyone does, really, the Post made sure of that, and he hasn't run away. That counts for something. I think about Daniel often. Wonder what he'd think of who I've become, of the choice I made with Jeremy, of this new life I'm building. I like to think he'd be proud, that he'd see the strength it took to walk away, the courage it took to choose myself. But I don't know. Maybe he'd think I gave up too easily. Maybe he'd have found another way. But Daniel isn't here, and I am, and I have to make choices based on what I can live with, not what someone else might have done. The grief is still there. For Jeremy as he was, for the family I thought we were, for the future I'd imagined. Some days it's a dull ache in the background. Other days it's sharp and immediate, hitting me when I least expect it. When I see a mother and adult son laughing together in the grocery store, when someone mentions grandchildren, when I realize I'm planning my future alone. But I'm learning to carry it. Grief doesn't have to define you. It can just be something you hold while you do other things, while you build other joys. I don't know what the future holds with Jeremy. Maybe we'll continue rebuilding slowly, and someday we'll have something that resembles a healthy relationship. Maybe we won't. Maybe he'll backslide, or maybe I'll realize that even his best efforts aren't enough to overcome the damage that was done. I'm prepared for either outcome. Because I've learned the most important lesson of all, I can survive losing him. I already have. If you're reading this, if you've made it through this entire story, I want you to know something. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You don't have to give until there's nothing left. You don't have to accept cruelty in the name of family. And if you've been told that setting boundaries makes you selfish, that saying no makes you a bad parent or child or spouse or friend, you've been lied to. Love without respect isn't love. Sacrifice without reciprocity isn't virtue. And staying silent in the face of abuse isn't keeping the peace. It's sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's comfort. I spent 6 decades learning that lesson. But I learned it. And my life is better for it. To everyone who supported me through this journey, who subscribed to see how it ended, who shared the post, who sent messages of encouragement, who saw themselves in my story and decided to make different choices, thank you. You made me feel less alone. You made me feel seen. And that means more than I can express. To Jeremy, if you're reading this, I love you. I probably always will. But I love myself too now. And that's not something I'm willing to give up ever again, not even for you. This is Patricia Williamson, signing off. Not as a victim. Not as a cautionary tale. Just as a woman who learned to choose herself, who learned that survival sometimes means letting go, who learned that the quietest woman can have the loudest voice when she finally decides to use it. And I'm still here. Scarred. Yes. Changed. Absolutely. But here. Living. Building. Becoming. And that's enough. Asterisk asterisk the end asterisk asterisk. Asterisk if this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about people who refused to stay silent, who chose themselves, who learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Check the description box below for resources on financial abuse, setting boundaries, and rebuilding after family trauma. You're not alone. You never were. Asterisk.